and studying, and I stumbled across an article about Alasdair Gray and his paraphrase, and not translation, Gray would say, of Dante's Divine Comedy. And the journalist, Ian Sampson, wrote that, I quote, Gray was rather like Dante, astonishingly inventive, an insider-outsider in his own land, who profoundly understood the relationship between language, dialect, and power, a fearless iconoclast unafraid to combine historical and contemporary subjects in his work, a true geographer of the imagination. And this description of Great Dante was, for me, the paradigm of a very original relation between an Italian writer and a Scottish writer. And I underline original. I had an interesting meeting at the Institute with a person who knew Gray, and I think this person is in the audience now. And I find out that Gray didn't know Italian and based his version of the Divine Comedy on several English translations. And I think that this makes the relation of Gray to Dante even more interesting. And it is a privilege to have such an eminent panel of experts tonight who will talk us through this relation and through the fascinating connections between Dante and Scottish writers, translators, artists, and composers. So before I leave you, I would like to thank Cassie, Sosha, Simona, Alan, Carla, who made this event possible, and our speakers, our guides across this beautifully interdisciplinary journey. And I would like to thank you all for joining us today. So without any more ado, I will leave the floor now to Lucilla Giagnoni, and thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, and good evening. I'm sorry, I don't speak English fluently, and I'm not so correct. I'm an actress. I'm an Italian director of an Italian theater, and I have been studying Dante since I was young. The thing I can say tonight is that Dante has a female voice. That is something really strange. Are you here? I don't see anyone. Oh.
Yes, we're all here, all good.
Okay, because I see all black.
Yeah.
On my screen, so my idea is that Dante has a female voice, so because he's looking for a female language that is lingua madre in Italian, that is the language of Pappo e Dindi, he says, the language that mothers give to their children while they are nourishing them. So he's looking for a language that's coming from love from mother to child. And the other thing that I can say that the final point, the arrival of a human being is the last meeting, the last character you meet in Divina Commedia, that is Vergine Madre. That is the last character he meets in his journey, and Vergine Madre, they are virgin and mother, figlia del tuo figlio, son of her son, umile e alta. Umile, it is in English. Umile, give me an help. Umile, umile, no. Can you help me? Umile.
Humble,
and height. So in one verse, he says opposite terms that are joined together in one character. That is the most complete aiutatemi, il personaggio più completo, più santo, il punto di arrivo dell'umano, la Vergine Madre.
So the saintest, most particular character, so the Virgin Mother.
So is the final point, the rival. So there are female signs all among the Divina Commedia, and so I'm proud. Sono orgogliosa di avergli dato voce, aiutatemi perché...
So I'm proud to have given my voice to
Yeah.
the Divina Commedia.
Che è stata sempre interpretata da uomini molto importanti.
That has always been recited by men, important men, but always by men.
Che hanno sempre interpretato il testo, con molta devozione, con molta devozione.
I've always been devoted in the interpretation of the text.
Come lavorando sull'autoritas del testo.
So working on the text authoritas and the authority of the text.
Ma nessuno intuendo che c'è un personaggio che parla e che soffre, che piange.
But they didn't seem to understand that there was a character that speaks and suffers and cries.
Che è Dante stesso.
Who's Dante himself.
Così la differenza è dire: nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita.
So the difference is between saying the sentence as Lucilla said it.
Oppure, nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che la diritta via era smarrita.
Or the second way of pronouncing it.
Cioè c'è un pensiero di un uomo che soffre, che viaggia e secondo me solo uno sguardo femminile poteva intuire di stare, come si dice, in his shoes, e questo shoes.
So there's the thought of a man who travels and thinks, and only a female brain could try and really be on his shoes.
E secondo me lo sguardo della Divina Commedia, punto d'arrivo e compimento, è uno sguardo femminile. Cioè
I think the Divina Commedia has an overlook, a glaze that is a female one.
Perché l'anima ha una voce femminile.
Because because the soul has a female voice.
Ed è quella che cerca Dante.
And that's what Dante is looking for.
Tramite Beatrice.
Through Beatrice.
E poi con l'arrivo all'incontro con Vergine Madre e poi con la luce finale.
And then meeting the Virgin Mother and the final light. Thank you, Lucilla.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucilla and Chiara, and you're all in for a treat later when we show you some of the readings of Lucilla later on. They really are wonderful. Just to give you a quick run through of the format, so the first session will be starting shortly, and it's called Grey Dante in Scotland, and it'll be chaired by Carla Sassy, and it will be speakers from Dara O'Connell and Susan Bassnett. Then we'll have a 5-minute comfort break around 4:45 for 5 minutes. We'll reconvene around 4:50 for the second session, which is text, visualization and music. Alan Rioch will be chairing that, and speakers will be Murdo MacDonald, John Purser and Joseph Farrell. At 6-ish, there will be questions and answers. And as Cassie said, if you can use a Q&A to post throughout the sessions, any questions that you have, if you want to post for particular speakers, that would be great. With readings followed at 6:15 by Lucilla and by Alan. And then there'll be a thanks and goodbye at 6:30. So before you sit back and enjoy a Scottish journey through the Divine Comedy, I'd like to introduce the chair for the first session, Carla Sassy. Carla is Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of Verona and convener of the International Association for the Study of Scottish Literatures for the period of 2020 to 2023. She specialises in Scottish literature with a special focus on modern and contemporary authors. She's just finished co-editing a special issue of Humanities on Environment, Ecology, Climate and Nature in 20th century Scottish literature. So over to you, Carla.
Thank you, Sorcha, and also thanks to Lucilla and Chiara for such wonderful introductory presentations. So hello, everyone. Welcome again to this very special event. You already know who I am. I'm delighted and honored to be introducing and chairing this first panel on Dante Gray in Scotland, which will include two very distinguished scholars, Professor Dara O'Connell and Professor Susan Bastnett. Without further ado, let me share with you some thoughts and notes on the relationship and interconnections between Dante Alighieri and Alasdair Gray, one of the most celebrated and rightly so writers of contemporary Scotland. In Karen Blixen's An Immigrant's Notebook, an anecdote from her memoir Out of Africa, a man gets up in the middle of a winter night to investigate the source of a sound outside his house. He runs back and forth across his garden and eventually returns exhausted to bed. Looking out of the window the next morning, he sees that his apparently random steps have traced the figure of a stork in the snow. Is it possible to understand the meaning of one's life? Blixen's anecdote may indeed be interpreted in different ways, but at its core, it is a haunting suggestion that it is indeed possible. And it is usually at the very end of our lives that apparently unconnected and random happenings suddenly coalesce into a discernible pattern. Blixen's story came to my mind when, in January this year, I had in my hands the 3 volumes of Dante's Divine Trilogy, Englished in prosaic verse by Alasdair Gray, and wondered for the first time if the extraordinary challenge of translating this dauntingly complex and vast masterpiece, which already counted several translations in the English language, should really be interpreted as a last extravagant show of bravura, somehow unrelated to the Alasdair Gray we all know and admire, as indeed most reviewers seem to imply. Quote, everyone who's anyone has had a go at Dante at some time in their life, and often towards the very end, states somewhat dismissively the reviewer of Paradise in the Guardian. It has become a final rite of passage. If one thing characterizes Gray's life and career as a writer is his unconditional, uncompromising commitment to his vision, his integrity as an artist and as a human being, it is difficult to believe that he would have engaged in such a demanding task, especially when he must have been aware that he did not have much time ahead of him, had not the Divina Commedia had a special central role in his imagination. The translations indeed may be seen as a cue that may reorientate or add something to our critical understanding of Gray's work. In his arguably most Dantean work, Lanark, we come across an enigmatic declaration by the artist and Gray's alter ego, Duncan Thaw, that he wants, quote, to write a modern divine comedy with illustrations in the style of William Blake, end of quote. But neither Dante nor his Commedia are explicitly mentioned in the long and tongue-in-cheek detailed list of plagiarisms at the end of the novel. Not even as an example of diff plag or diffuse plagiarism in Gray's words, quote, where scenery, characters, actions, or novel ideas have been stolen without the original words describing them, end of quote. And yet, rereading Lanark from this newly discovered perspective makes one dizzy with endless possible references to and intersections with the Commedia. Here are just a few. There is the very central theme of the Lost City with Doom, Glasgow and Thank, a place of internal exile for Duncan Lanark, evoking Dante's Florence in more than one way, and that of the inaccessible woman. Is Rima's name a quite explicit homage to that terza rima that Gray makes the uncommon attempt at recreating in his translations? And then there are, of course, the creative and imaginative punishments tormenting the bodies and the minds of the miserable citizens of Unthank, the monstrous transformations symbolizing their sins, the hellish underworld of the Institute, accessed through the selva oscura of the necropolis. There is even the appearance of a harsh and judging, indeed infernal God author at the end of the novel, and much more. it doesn't possibly make sense that the Divine Comedy is not classified by Gray and Lanark as div plug. In fact, it is much more than an accidental or self-conscious quotation of another writer's work. It is closer to a parodic rewriting, revealing an unexpected interpenetration of views and an attempt to inscribe the commedia in contemporary memory. In many of the inventions and themes that define and structure Lanark are indeed loosely inspired by Dante. Then it would seem appropriate to claim that Gray saw in the commedia, first and foremost, an essential interpretative key to his tormented times, which to Russian poet Osip Mandelstam would seem like just the right thing to do. It is inconceivable to read Dante's cantos without directing them towards contemporaneity, he daringly claimed. They are missiles for capturing the future. His contemporaneity is continuous, incalculable, and inexhaustible, end of quote. And we may expect that even the Albanian writer Ismail Kadare may see the logic of Gray's approach. Quote, "Our planet is much too small to avoid Dante Alighieri," he observes in his essay, Dante the Inevitable. "One cannot escape Dante any more than one can escape one's conscience. No other literary work has held humanity, or rather its collapse, in the same way," end of quote. In short, what I'm suggesting here is that Dante represented for Gray an inescapably contemporary vision and provided him with some of the tools he needed to construct his own unique vision. His specific adaptation of Dante is indeed unique, and yet his approach is shared across borders by other modern and contemporary writers who adapted, like him, the polymorph commedia to clarify and address the most diverse historical and political context. And if Gray's translation of the Commedia, his last work, may shed light retrospectively on hitherto overlooked aspects of his fiction, it is also true that we can use Lanark to shed light on the strange quality of his translations, showing deference to the original text, but also creative, elliptical, idiosyncratic, inescapably and inevitably contemporary. This is but the first step in our Scottish journey through the Divine Comedy. The next papers will enlighten us with different and exciting perspectives on Dante across the British Isles and Dante in translation. I'm delighted to introduce our first speaker, Professor Dara O'Connell, who is the head of the Department of Italian at University College Cork, where he's also the director of the Centre for Dante Studies in Ireland. He researches across 3 distinct areas: Dante studies, Vico and 18th century Neapolitan culture, and modern and contemporary Sicilian literary culture. He's currently working on a monograph on courting Dante, love and politics in the Divine Comedy, and he has co-edited 3 volumes on Dante: Nature and Art in Dante, 2013, War and Peace in Dante, 2015, and Dante and the 7 Deadly Sin, 2017. And today he's going to speak on Dante between Belfast and Glasgow, Alasdair Gray, Kieran Carson, and Philip Terry.
Okay, thank you, Carla. Can you all see my screen? Okay, so thank you, Carla, and thank you, Alan, and all the organisers for this invitation. It's a real honour to be here, albeit virtually. And I must say, I quite fancied a trip to Glasgow to revisit my old haunts when I lived there many years ago. So when coming up with the title, I was very drawn actually to the natural links that exist between the 2 cities. But as you will see today, that my focus will be less on the vernacular peculiarities of place than with translation or adherence, I suppose, to form. Now, as is well known, Dante wrote his Commedia availing of the Italian Hendic-Slavic line and employing, in order to kind of propel the narrative machinery of his poem ever forward, the technique of the terza rima, or third rhyme, this interlocking rhyming tercets, what Douglas Dunn elsewhere has called Dante's drum kit. So I'd like to begin with a quote from Dante's linguistic treatise, the De Vulgare Eloquentia, and there in book 1, he writes, and I'll quote the English here, "To me, however, the whole world is a homeland like the sea, to fish, and although for my own enjoyment, or rather for the justification of my own desire, there is no more agreeable place on earth than Florence, yet when I turn the pages of the volumes of poets and other writers, by whom the world is described as a whole and its constituent parts, I am convinced and firmly maintain that there are many regions and cities more noble and more delightful than Tuscany and Florence, where I was born and of which I am a citizen, and many nations and peoples who speak a more elegant and practical language than do the Italians." Now, I'm not about to claim that Glasgow, or the Glasgow, indeed the Belfast of my title, are more noble or more delightful than Florence, but it is their very vernacularity, I think, which singles them out on the linguistic plane. Here, Dante positions himself as both a Florentine and a transnational reader of the world, at once local and global, rooted in the specificity of place, and yet open to the possibility of otherness, linguistic, cultural, and poetic. Therefore, Dante's Florentine vernacular and the unnamed languages of others in this formulation seem to concord rather than compete in what is essentially an invocation to linguistic plurality. However, such harmony in the diversity of tongues does not necessarily carry over traducens when entering the realm of translation itself. And Dante's by now infamous injunction against the translation of poetry, articulated in his other treatise in Italian, the Convivio, is, I think, particularly pertinent, as you will see from the second quotation, on which I am going to quote in the original. "E però sappia ciascuno che nulla cosa del legame mosaico armonizzate si può dalla sola quella in alta trasmutare, senza rompere tutta la sua dolcezza ed armonia." It is a stark and definitive statement, nulla cosa, that brooks no possibility of integration. And yet it is the gauntlet which has been thrown down to translators over the centuries. How do you protect the sweetness and harmony? Is it possible to translate, if you like, poetic form, what Dante in the De Vulgare Eloquentia actually calls the concatenatio pulchra? And this question, I think, is particularly pressing in the first half of the 21st century, when the kind of burgeoning readerly appetite for Dante extends well beyond the scholarly translations of the Commedia to that other realm of translational exercise, when poets translate other poets. Because, as we know, something very different emerges. And I think really in the cases of Alasdair Gray and Kieran Carson, and though I won't have much time to deal with him in great depth, also with Philip Terry, this something very different is very much to the fore. So what follows is but a partial interrogation of these three contrasting translations, the strategies adopted, the analysis of those kind of paratextual moments in which the poet translators convey or intimate their preferences, biases, and disapproval, in order to kind of, I suppose, understand better the dichotomous friction between what another translator of Dante, Mark Musa, called the tyranny of rhyme. So you have this on the one hand, and the Dante concatenatio pulchra on the other. And sticking with Dante for a moment, his concatenatio pulchra, whilst it is alluring, it is exactly that sweetness and harmony which needs to be broken when changing from one language to the next. Again, in the Convivio, Dante also states that every poem has two distinct aspects, what he calls bellezza and bontade. Now, I'm not going to read out the quote, but the bellezza is to be found in its formal aspects, in what Dante calls the ornament of the words. And this is achieved through the poet's ability to handle metrical, grammatical, and rhetorical techniques. And conversely, the bontade is synonymous with sentenza, that is, its meaning and its content. And these two aspects are easily interchangeable. One can appreciate a poem's beauty without necessarily understanding its meaning. A literary work can have bellezza without bontade, and vice versa. In other words, it may contain an untrue or indeed an immoral meaning, but have a beautiful form all the same. And perhaps this formulation better suits, I think, our translational discussion. And that's not to say that Gray, Carson, and Terry are all bontade or conversely all bellezza, but our poet translators can at times weigh more heavily on one side than the other. Now, So what of our three poets? Well, let me just first very quickly mention Philip Terry, born in Belfast and resident in England for a long time now. His 2014 Dante's Inferno, he kind of brilliantly shifts the action from 12th century Italy to the present day and relocates it to a kind of modern walled city of the University of Essex. Dante's Flegeton becomes the River Colne, and his popes are replaced by vice-chancellors and education ministers. His warring Guelphs and Ghibellines are reimagined as sectarian loyalists and Republicans in Northern Ireland. Meanwhile, Terry's Virgil is transformed into the American poet Ted Berrigan, one time visiting professor at Essex and poet who himself had imagined the underworld. Alasdair Gray's brilliantly constructed and decorated Hell, Purgatory and Paradise is very different indeed. And I think the title pages alone inform the reader of what to expect. Englished in prosaic verse. And it's a wonderful expression. And Gray informs us in the foreword to Inferno that his version seeks to maintain Dante's colloquial Italian by using end rhymes when they come easily. And what he means by easily is a little more difficult to unpack, and also internal rhymes when they do not. And he writes, and I quote, "My abrupt North British dialect has cut Dante's epic down to the range of my intelligence." And he adds, which is less than Dante's. And he then goes on to give two examples of his homegrown abruptness, the extra syllable for Beatrice, and his transformation of Ghibelline and Guelph into Tory and Whig, old and new money. His foreword to the Purgatory offers no further hints as to his kind of translational method, only an explanation for the existence of the mountain. And sadly, there is no foreword to Paradiso. But in many instances, what he does, he condenses and he compresses much of the action of Dante's poem, resulting in much shorter cantos. But this is all really done in the service of the poetry. Kieran Carson's 2002 Inferno is straight out of Belfast. In the introduction, he writes, "The deeper I got into the Inferno, the more I walked, hunting for a rhyme, trying to construe a turn of phrase. I'd leave the desk and take to the road, lines unraveling in my mind. Usually I'd head for the old Belfast waterworks on one of Belfast's sectarian fault lines." And here he conjures up various images from the Troubles, including the ever-present British Army helicopters hovering overhead, and likens one to Gerione, Dante's beast for fraud, who will literally carry him down into the Malebolge. But Carson reminds us in his introduction, and in this he's quite similar to Gray, that many translations seem to forget that Dante wrote in the vernacular. And Carson's technique is the Hiberno English ballad, and it seems that as a model, it allows for some extravagant alliteration and other features, taking in both formal discourse and the language of the street. And he states, "As I walked the streets of Belfast, I wanted to get something of that music." Now, I would like to use Inferno Canto 13 as a kind of case study for these translations. My reasons for doing so is that this particular canto throws up a number of translational issues, not least the fact that there's a deliberate overabundance of rhetorical tropes. And it is also, I suppose, one of my favorites, so I have to admit that too. Canto 13 shows Dante at his very best. A lot is at stake in this canto, where we will meet the figure of Per de la Vigne in the Wood of the Suicides. And his case is complicated by the kind of implicit correspondence between his experience and Dante's own, as both were poet rhetoricians who devoted their talents to civil service, and both claim to be unjustly condemned by their governments. Therefore, language itself is the true focus of this canto. Indeed, the ambiguous nature of language to conceal, to reveal, and to problematize truth is very much to the fore. So here are the first 9 lines of the canto, and already we see marked change of register from the preceding cantos. A sense of disharmony pervades, and it is deliberately verbal. Already we see rhetoric prominent with a fine example of anaphora. We have 3 tercets beginning with non, and the middle one has each line beginning with. It has this very strongly antithetical pattern, as this is a canto about suicide, the negation of life. So it stands to reason, therefore, that it should begin on a resounding note of negation. All 3 translators, I think, here are sensitive to this move, with perhaps Carson here sticking closely to Dante. But Gray's middle tercet pattern of no but, I think, is very effective. And also the bosco di un sentiero should recall the dark wood and the straight path, which was lost back in Canto 1 of the Inferno. A little further down, we get this wonderful example of Polyptoton, credio, che credette, che io credesse, involving the parts of credere. And we have the stammering effect that's very expressive of confusion. fede and credere, faith and belief, are extremely important again in this canto. And all three translators manipulated reasonably well within the constraints of English without putting, I think, too much pressure on the forms of the verb to think. Now, I want to jump forward a little to Pierre's speech. So just to contextualize, all the suicides in Inferno are transformed into hideous trees as they negated their forms in life, so they are denied their forms in eternal damnation. Dante, encouraged by Virgil to break off one of the branches, linking this canto to the Polydorus episode in the Aeneid, only to discover a soul residing in the tree. And he entreats him to speak. And what follows, therefore, is Piero's speech. Now, Piero's identity is denied to him, just as he negated his own life. He is referred to solely as il tronco, and the style of speech is complex and highly artificial. A myriad of rhetorical devices, alliteration, periphrasis, antithesis, figurative vocabulary, and various forms of wordplay. So fundamentally, it's a dazzling display of verbal virtuosity and a nightmare for any translator. So note first, I think, the alliteration of dolce dir, adesci, and the two rhyme words, adesci and invesci, are very precious metaphors. Adesci is a fishing term, and the root word esca means bait, whereas invesciarsi is borrowed from the language of bird catching, meaning to be caught in a snare. So thus, Piero is aware that by speaking, he's falling into a trap. Now, Gray's version ignores this, but does anticipate the courtly discourse later on in the speech. And it is clear throughout the Divine Comedy that Gray condenses many of Dante's moments and reduces the content significantly. Carson does rather supply the inveigo, me, and sweet words, so, and that does at least suggest some alliteration. And that overly explained neatly points to Piero's rhetorical mode of speaking. Terry, conversely, cuts out all of this material. So who is this Tronco? Well, Pier della Vigna died in 1249. He was a jurist at the court of Emperor Frederick II, and he became Frederick's chief advisor and occupied that position for more than 20 years. And Dante here emphasizes Piero's literary reputation as one of the great stylists of the Middle Ages. He was accused of treason, imprisoned, blinded, and in his despair, he bashed his head against the prison walls and died as a result of his injuries. So here in these lines, he launches into this periphrasis. And note there the alliteration of secreto su and this wordplay of serrando and disserrando. And this is also a veiled play on Piero's name with St. Peter, the metaphor of the keys. Think of the papal insignia. And through them, humanity is said to enter the kingdom of God. But Piero's focus is exclusively and firmly on the figure of Frederick, who incidentally Dante had already damned amongst the Epicureans back in Canto 10. Now, Gray's rendering extends the meaning to, and I really like this, reward and punishment, I think, which is quite brilliant, despite the brevity of its articulation. Carson, who again is closest to Dante here, and then we also have Terry, who kind of moves on from the original to introduce an unnamed drug user on campus. There's also wordplay around Frederick's name, especially with regard to Si Suave, or the Swabian, as he was known for the Hohenstaufen family. And Gray has obviously identified the wordplay and decides to extend this further by introducing Frederick's Latin moniker Stupor Mundi, and then goes on to translate this as wonder of the world. And this, I think, is quite an original solution. Carson's noiselessly, though suggestive of much else besides, doesn't quite touch on the kind of protean aspect of Suave. Also, Piero's misplaced loyalty or faith is placed entirely in his service to Frederick, whose name ironically means rich in faith. And this link, I think, is naturally lost in these English versions. Now, the next lines demonstrate another complex periphrasis. The harlot or the prostitute is envy, the invidia. But this is only revealed in line 78. And this is a case, if you like, of the retardatio nominis. And we should also note, too, the kind of incremental grandeur of Frederick, who is now called Caesar. Of all the three translations, only Carson's extends this image to wanton eyes after putti. And then we have another of these kind of threefold polyptotons with infiammare. Gray ignores this part and this is really part of his kind of condensing of material, whereas Carson does make a stab at it. However, all three iterations have the same form, though they do function differently. And Terry, at this point, returns to Dante's text momentarily with his inflaming. Now, as I mentioned earlier, There is this incremental grandeur to Frederick, who goes from his name to Caesar, now Augustus, and amusingly, Terry has him as a university dean. But now we arrive at the kind of rhetorical climax and conclusion of the speech. There we have further wordplay, this distegnoso, distegno, indegno. Now Gray retains the D sound with disgrace, and Carson cannot hold a kind of lexical symmetry with disgust, and worth. And here, the whole line is based on the antithesis ingiusto, giusto, redolent of Piero's contradictory motivation. However, if we needed to see the act of suicide, if you like, icastically performed through poetic language, we need look no further than this line. It forcefully represents the outrage committed by one half of the human being against the other, the divided self, if you like, in other conflict. And it has to be said that none of the translations here were able to match Dante's kind of verbal ingenuity. At least, however, Gray is successful in his rearranging the accent of the verse by making just and unjust as end rhymes. Now, in the interest of time, I'm just going to, if you like, skip forward a little bit. This is Giotto's depiction rather of envy from the Scrovegni chapel, with the snake biting the eyes of the figure of envy, this occhi putti, because we know envy comes from invidere, this is distorted sight. And then on the right there is Limo Brin's depiction of the wood of the suicide. So by way of complication, or sorry, of conclusion, I'm aware that perhaps I'm just being a little bit unfair to subject the three poets to an examination of their respective handling of Canto 13 because of its rhetorical features. I think, however, nonetheless, it is instructive, and also a demonstration of when language itself becomes the focus of attention for Dante. And quite often those that come in his way cannot exactly match the operations that are at play. What emerges, I think, is something new and indeed unexpected. In Canto 22 of Purgatorio, what had been one guide becomes two, when Dante and Virgil are accompanied by the Roman poet Statius until the end of the canticle. And thus we have three poets together. In fact, Mount Purgatory is where Dante meets his poet friends and he encounters poetic masters, and they discourse on poetry itself. It is, if you like, the canticle of the poets. And Botticelli here is alone, I think, amongst the great early illustrators of capturing this moment of poetic encounter. And Dante has it thus. He says, Egli givan dinanzi io soletto diretto e ascoltavi i loro sermoni che a poetar mi davano intelletto. Alasdair Gray translate this, I think, exquisitely as I followed very close behind, learning much from their talk of poetry, how I should write my own. It is the briefest of snapshots into the private world of poets encountering and communicating with one another across time and place, a moment of literary poetic shop talk, and one where we see Gray, the apprentice, rightly take on the mantle of poet. Now, for other poets such as T.S. Eliot, embracing Dante is like a discrete lexical exercise, devoid of the local and resoundingly Latinate. Dante is some kind of universal heir to Virgilian gravitas. However, this is to deny the vernacularity of Dante, the local, the everyday, the kinetic, propulsive poet of plurilingual expression, stripped of the robes of commentary. And this, I think, is the poet that Carson, that Terry, and that Gray read. To borrow Seamus Heaney's trenchant phrase in reference to Ossip Mandelstam, but really Heaney, who is, let's not forget, another poet translator of Dante, because he's really talking about himself here. He says, and I quote, "His Dante is a voluble Shakespearean figure, a woodcutter singing at his work in the dark wood of the larynx." The same can equally be said of Kieran Carson and Alasdair Gray from the dark woods of Belfast and Glasgow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dara, for this wide-ranging, wonderful investigation of the vernacularity of Dante. I'm sure there will be many questions. It is my pleasure now to introduce the next speaker, Professor Susan Basnett, who is a writer, a translator, and professor of comparative literature at the University of Glasgow. She's one of the founders of the discipline of translation studies and has published extensively in this field. She is an elected fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Institute of Linguists, and the Accademia Europea, and is the president of the British Comparative Literature Association. And today she's going to speak on Dante in translation.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the organizers, and particular thanks for the invitation to take part in this, which I've really been looking forward to. Now, of the three great medieval Italian writers, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, Dante has been the odd one out in terms of English translations. The Divina Commedia was not translated in full until 1802, possibly because a work so deeply rooted in Catholic theology and structured around medieval cosmology failed to have very much resonance in a society going through the Protestant Reformation and then affected by the new scientific discoveries of Galileo and Copernicus. But the publication in 1814 of Francis Carey's blank verse translation seemed to herald a new interest in Dante in English, swept along by romantic ideals of individualism. So through the 19th century, there were dozens of translations, many of them now inspired by the fashion for medievalism. We might think of the Gothic revival, the Pre-Raphaelites, the historical novels of Walter Scott and many others. Also by the Oxford movement and the rise of Anglo-Catholicism. Longfellow was one of the many Dante translators, and he's even honored by a plaque in the Piazza Santa Maria Novella in Florence that describes him as traduttore della Divina Commedia, nelle lingue neolatine maestro. While the impact of Gustave Doré's illustrations from the 1860s seemed to add further to the rising popularity of Dante. By the time T.S. Eliot was writing about Dante in the early 20th century, he could declare that, I quote, Dante's is the most comprehensive and the most ordered presentation of emotions that has ever been made. Now, translations continued through the 20th century. We've just heard a splendid paper on three of those translations. And the Penguin translation by Dorothy Sayers, previously best known for her detective fiction, stayed in print for decades. Her Inferno came out in 1949 and included a 66-page introduction in which she discusses Dante's life and work and explains why she felt it was so important to include detailed notes for every canto of her translation. We need to know what Dante's characters stood for in his eyes, she declared, and therefore we need to know who they were. Because Dante's poem for his contemporaries was a poem à clé. It was the work of an angry, disillusioned man, accused of fraud and corruption, tried in his absence and sentenced to exile from his native Florence while still only in his late 30s. The revenge he enacted on some of the people he most despised by subjecting them to eternal torments in hell would have been clear to many of his contemporary readers, though it's lost on readers today without the benefit of explanatory notes. However, Sayers' notes were minuscule compared to the edition of the Commedia that I had to use as a student by Natalino Sapegno, which took up more space on every page. The notes took up more space, that is, than the actual text of the poem. This was the edition I had to use, and I lost count of how many times I used to complain that we were losing sight of Dante as a poet, as we plowed through notes giving details of all the references to people, places, and historical events. Now, the translator Robert Durling, whose version of the Inferno came out in 1966, also includes pages of notes. But as he put it, justifying this decision, more than any other European poem, The Commedia is a detailed commentary on the political, economic, and social developments of the author's times. And with this comment, I think we can see that another shift in translations of Dante had been taking place. No longer seen primarily as a medieval religious poet, nor as the story of a troubled individual who moves from finding himself lost in a dark wood to an ultimate spiritual experience that words cannot express. Dante was coming to be increasingly read as a political poet. And translators have endeavored to translate, I use translate very broadly in this sense, that political dimension without having recourse to pages of notes. And so, for example, in the preface to his version of the Inferno, Kieran Carson, who we've just been hearing about, finds parallels with Dante's Florence and the sectarianism of his native Belfast. He, in commenting on how Dante's, the Guelfi and the Ghibellini could be characterized in all kinds of ways, Kieran Carson finds a way of comparing that to Belfast and says this: natives in Belfast claim they can tell each other's identities, Protestant or Catholic, by a combination of accent, vocabulary, clothes, bearing, gesture. The souls in Dante's hell reveal themselves by a phrase, by body language, a nod, an eyebrow twitch, the plucking of a garment. By these words, these actions, they epitomize their past lives. And Kieran writes himself into his translation. And so to some extent does the American poet Mary Jo Bang, whose Inferno came out in 2012 and is full of references to contemporary culture. Jotting just a few down: Colonel Gaddafi, Bob Dylan, rock music, South Park, and to cultural icons such as Freud or Emily Dickinson or Milton or Mayakovsky. Now, translation has not been very highly regarded in the English-speaking world and has all too often been seen as hack work of a lower status than an original. Literary and cultural historians have tended to downplay the importance of translations as a shaping force in literature, and the negative discourse that a translation is somehow a betrayal of an author's work is unfortunately still with us, having been around for a very long time. With the growth of the field known as translation studies, this situation is, albeit very, very slowly, starting to change. And there is increased recognition that translation is in fact a highly complex activity and also a very creative one, because translation requires not only linguistic competence, but cultural competence too. A work that is created in one moment in time for one set of readers has to be dismembered and then recreated. And I call this remembering, a sort of play on the idea of dismembering. It has to be recreated in another moment in a different cultural context. The Mexican Nobel laureate Octavio Paz has pointed out that poetry and translation are both highly creative activities, twin activities. The poet, says Paz, fixes the verbal signs of a text in one language, and then the translator liberates, and I like the idea of that, frees those verbal signs and recreates them in another language. What this means, of course, is that when we read a translation, any translation, what we encounter is the physical manifestation of one translator's reading, one translator's act of liberating and interpreting the source text. Now, the American poet Elliot Weinberger, also a great translator, has declared that poetry is that which is worth translating, and adds, following Walter Benjamin, translation is what keeps literature alive. But as we know, any of you who've tried translating know that when you tackle a piece of writing from another age, there's a whole host of problems that go far beyond the linguistic. A translator of works by contemporary writers could get in touch with them and ask questions. You can't do that if the creator of a work is long dead. Moreover, the amount of editorial, scribal, general textual interference in texts from previous periods is so enormous that sometimes we're left, in fact, very often we're left with doubts as to what exactly the original text is. Josephine Balmer, who translates from Greek and Latin, she has put it really rather nicely when she talks about her own translation. She sees herself as a recreator, or as she puts it, a transgressor. And she says this: it's often necessary for a translator to don a flak jacket, to step out into the firing range of no man's land between translation and original, scholarship and creativity. Now, Alasdair Gray stepped out into that no man's land with his translation of Dante. For any translator of Dante in the 21st century, the problems are vast. Our universe is configured differently to Dante's. Society today is increasingly secular. Dante's contemporary references to people, places, and events have ceased to have any meaning. In short, Dante's worldview has long since vanished. His boldness in choosing to write in the Italian vernacular, his choice of the innovative terza rima are no longer resonant, I should say, and he has acquired canonical status, which is always a big impediment to any translator. And so what does Gray do? Most obviously, he reduces the text. He cuts the number of lines in every canto. I read his translation side by side with the dreaded Sapegno, and I found myself very impressed by the cleverness of Gray's solutions. For in reducing the text of Dante's poem, he actually caters for 21st century readers through some very canny summaries or subtle additions that explain some of the material that other translators and editors have had to put into footnotes. So, for example, in Canto 30 of Purgatory, where Dante meets Beatrice, and Virgil, who's been his guide to the mountain, vanishes, what Gray does is to give us the image of the child running to his mother. But through some very subtle additions, he explains how Dante first met Beatrice. I quote, "I had not felt the awe now filling me for many years. I had first felt it when, a child of 9, I met another child I loved unselfishly, and so knew then what press of adult care made me forget that love can be and ought to be divine." At other points, he cuts Dante's text radically, as in, staying with Purgatorio in Canto 32, a lot of the details of church corruption are cut. Interestingly, he gives a title to every canto, and this canto is actually simply entitled Of the Kirk. And his translation, Gray's translation, is full of Scotticisms. And I particularly like the moment when Dante meets Guido Guinicelli and Arnaud Daniel, 2 fellow poets, and says that the couple gaped like Highlanders, bemused by city streets. Now, the majority of English translations are of the Inferno, probably because there's more direct description and less philosophizing than in the other 2 cantos. And also, as with Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost, the depiction of evil tends to be meatier than the depiction of purity. And I've often heard students say that they enjoyed the Inferno, but then found Purgatorio hard-going and Paradiso particularly hard-going. I doubt if they'd say that if they were to read Alasdair Gray's version, because he's worked so skillfully with Purgatorio and Paradiso that he's managed to make them reader-friendly in our very unspiritual 21st century. He's carefully and creatively worked through the philosophical material, and through his cuts, his additions, and his summaries, he's created a version of the comedy that is meaningful to contemporary readers. Though I've got to say at this point that the one thing I don't like, I think the Guardian reviewer said the same, is the Whig and Tory parallel. I think when we come to Whigs massacring Tory refugees, it really feels rather silly. And I think that's his one big mistake. But the question that is very often asked is, why do successful writers like Alasdair Gray bother to translate? In my view, this is the wrong question to ask. A very large number of great writers also translate, something that literary critics and historians too often tend to forget. Perhaps the best way of thinking about translating a writer is to think, as Ezra Pound put it, of paying homage to another writer. And it might also be a way of writing anew something that the writer-translator wishes they'd written themselves in the first instance. I don't know why Alasdair Gray chose to translate Dante's monumental work quite late in life, but I'm very glad he did. He's in good company. I was reminded that the aging Queen Elizabeth I translated Boethius De Consolatione Philosophiae in her 60s, when she had no need to translate anything at all. Now, translation is not only a writing experience, but an intense reading experience. Maybe Alasdair Gray wanted to think about how Dante depicted what happens after death. Maybe he wanted the challenge of translating one of Europe's great works. Maybe he found translating Dante playful. There's a lot of playfulness in Dante as well, and that might explain his Scottish colloquialisms. And I particularly like the end of Paradiso in Gray's version. Dante finds himself unable to express the perfection of what he sees. His intellect fails in the presence of God. But Alasdair Gray's intellect does not fail in the presence of God. He offers us a different ending, a far more assertive ending. He offers an ending that is a statement of the eternal power of love. And I just want to read these last few lines as my conclusion. Like the geometer battering his brain in vain to find out how circles are squared, I tried to see or feel how such a human form could live in light eternally. The wings of my fancy could not fly so far, until in a flash I saw desire and will. Both are a pair of finely balanced wheels, kept turning by the love that revolves sun, sky, and every star. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was truly enlightening, and thank you for this inspiring interpretation of Gray's translations. Okay, I think it's time for a break. Not more than 5 minutes. Is that okay? Yes, Sorsha?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you, everyone, for an inspiring first session. Yeah, a 5-minute break, and if anyone within that time would like to pose any questions in the Q&A function, please do that for the end of the next session. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all.
Carla, I think were you going to introduce Alan for the next session? It's great to see everyone back. We've had a few questions over the break, which is great for the session at the end, but I'd like to just hand over to Carla Sassi, who's going to introduce Alan Riach and start the next session.
Yes, Alan Riach is a poet and professor of Scottish literature at Glasgow University. He was born in Airdrie, Lanarkshire, studied at Cambridge and Glasgow, worked at the University of Waikato in New Zealand between 1986 and 2000, returned to Scotland in 2001. His books include poetry, The Winter Book, 2017, Homecoming, 2009, and Criticism, Hugh McDermott's epic poetry, 1991, represented Scotland, 2005, and co-authored with Alexander Moffat, Arts and Resistance, Poets, Portraits and Landscapes of Modern Scotland, 2008, Arts of Independence, The Cultural Argument and Why It Matters Most, 2014, and with Moffat and Ruth Nicol, Landmarks, McDermott's Brownsbank, 2021. His new comprehensive Scottish literature and introduction is due for publication in 2022. Off to you, Alan.
Okay, thank you very much, Carla. And thanks tremendously to Susan and to Dara for two tremendous papers introducing a whole range of questions to the subject. I'm here to chair the next session, but I did place in the introduction in the programme of events a few introductory pointers for such things as I might have said or would say in the context of a full paper, because there are hours and hours of material that we could talk about with relation to Dante being remediated, or as Susan put it, remembered in members of different kinds of language. And what we're looking at in a moment will be not only the remediation or the remembering through the languages of words, but also through the languages of images and the languages of music. And I was thinking about Susan's remarks on translation from one era to another, from one language to another, from one culture to another, but also thinking about the relationship of texts to each other in the context of translation from an oral culture to a literary or print-bred culture, and the complexities of that area opening up. So in terms of how William Blake remembered or remediated Dante, or Rodin, or T.S. Eliot, with whom we're all familiar, I guess, or Ezra Pound in the cantos, there's a multitude of things that could be said in all of these regards. So simply to highlight those areas. But to pause for a moment on the work of Charles Olson and his placing of Dante as the central of three Odysseys, which he says in his little book called Call Me Ishmael, begins with Homer. The evolution and the use of Ulysses as hero parallels what has happened in economic history. That Homer was the end of the myth world from which the Mediterranean began. In Ulysses, he projected the archetype of the West to follow, the creative act of anticipation. Ulysses is already pushing against the limits in Homer, seeking a way out, a way beyond. He is the individual responsible to himself. Dante's Ulysses in 1400 is again a prospective man, an Atlantic man, not only a Mediterranean, but an Atlantic man. And in the Inferno, he bends his crew to his purpose, forces them west as they drive through the pillars, cross the equator, and after 5 months on the Atlantic, find a new land, only to be destroyed and drowned before they can touch on it. Olson suggests that the third and final Odyssey was Ahab's in Moby Dick. The Atlantic crossed, the new land, America, known. The dream's death lay around the Horn, where west returned to east. The Pacific is the end of the unknown, which Homer's and Dante's Ulysses opened men's eyes to. The end of the individual responsible only to himself. Ahab is full stop. The link with Gray seems to me to come in the unlikely stories mostly, at the end of the first part of the story of the Axle Tree, which aficionados of Alasdair Gray's work will remember. Just to read it very briefly. At the end of this first part of the story, the emperor closed his eyes and seemed to doze. The politicians whispered to each other. Suddenly he cried out in a great voice, "Do not call it a tower. Towers are notorious for falling down. Tell the fools you are building a connection between two absolutely dependable things. Call it an axle tree." Then he giggled faintly and said, "I suppose one day the world will be governed by people whose feet never touch the ground. I wonder what will happen if there is a sky and they reach it." The emperor died and his tomb was built in the center of the capital city and enlarged to enclose everything he had wanted. For 2,000 years, this construction gave employment to mankind and a purpose to history. But there was a sky. We reached it. And everyone knows what happened after that. It's almost as if the rewriting of Dante and the remembering and the remediating of Dante in so many ways has such pertinence to the contemporary world. I'll come back to this perhaps later on, but I want to introduce our two speakers and allow them to take the next session away. First, we're having Murdo MacDonald talk to us. Murdo is an Emeritus Professor of History of Scottish Art at the University of Dundee. He's the author of Scottish Art in the Thames and Hudson World of Art series, in a new edition most recently. His research interests include the art of the Scottish Gaeltacht, with respect to which he's also co-edited Highland art from the collections of Royal Scottish Academy and Rethinking Highland Art, the visual significance of Gaelic culture, and co-curated the major exhibition Window to the West, the rediscovery of Highland art, held at the City Art Centre in Edinburgh from 2010 to 2011. Most recently, his research interests in Patrick Geddes have produced a book called Geddes' Intellectual Origins, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2020. Murdo also delivered the inaugural Andrew Tannehill Lecture, Scottish Literature and Visual Art, a Caledonian Synergy, at the National Library of Scotland in 2009. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts and a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and was appointed an honorary member of the Royal Scottish Academy in 2009. He lives in Stornoway, and he'll be talking to us now about Dante and visual art, a Scottish perspective. Murdo.
Thanks very much, Alan. Just great to be here. I'll try a bit of the screen sharing. Okay, here we go. I guess that should be working okay. Can everyone see that okay? Yeah, I'm sure you can. Okay. My own awareness of Dante actually began through visual art, specifically two images I saw as a child. Reproductions of Dante Gabriel Rossetti's Dream of Dante and Henry Holliday's Dante and Beatrice. They were tinted prints dating from about 1900 or so, and I saw them in a relative's house on the northeast coast of Scotland. Now, I came later to realize that Dante's Dream had a substantial Scottish connection, for it was commissioned in the late 1860s by Rossetti's friend and patron, the Glasgow businessman William Graham, then active in Liverpool. The painting shows a scene from Dante's poem La Vita Nuova, which Rossetti had translated to great effect. But my next childhood contact with Dante was also through art, when I found myself intrigued by a book published in Edinburgh in 1890. That book was Dante Illustrations and Notes by Phoebe Anna Traquair and John Sutherland Black. And it is that work that gives my presentation its backbone today. Phoebe Traquair was trained in her native Dublin, but after her marriage, she moved to Scotland to become one of the country's outstanding artists. The book was made as a series of illustrations, one of which we see here, and also notes to accompany the lectures on Dante. And the lectures were by the Presbyterian minister, Alexander White. Now, White was a key cultural figure in the Edinburgh of the time, a strong supporter not only of artists such as Phoebe Traquair herself, but also of writers such as Robert Louis Stevenson. when I began to read Alasdair Gray's wonderful translations, I immediately sought out my copy of Phoebe Traquair's book to help me find my way around by virtue of wonderful etched diagrams such as this one. And of course, I was intrigued by Alasdair Gray's own visual response. And as you can see, there is a wonderful resonance between the embossed cover that we find from Alasdair Gray in 2018 and the embossed cover by Phoebe Traquair made 128 years earlier. You may have noticed the scattered blossoms in Phoebe Traquair's image. Here we find her making a direct visual homage to Rossetti, who shows poppies symbolizing memory, sleep, and death scattered in the foreground of Dante's dream. Phoebe's blossoms are carnations rather than poppies, but the reference is clear. And those blossoms occur again on her beautiful end paper, a work of art in its own right, and a product not only of the artist's skill, but that of Walter Blakey of the printer T&A Constable, who a few years later would oversee the design and production of both Patrick Geddes' Evergreen and Alexander Carmichael's Carmina Gedelica. And again, one finds those scattered blossoms on the equally remarkable etched frontispiece, which shows Dante's challenging encounter with Beatrice, as recounted in Purgatorio, Canto 30. On the title page, Traquair shows her skill in yet another medium, a small wood engraving of Dante deep in thought. In 1890, the same year that Phoebe Traquair's Dante illustrations were published, we find a further indication of her interest in Rossetti, for she made a remarkable illumination of his key sonnet sequence, Willowwood. Willowwood is Rossetti's searing mystical reflection on the death of his beloved wife and pre-Raphaelite muse, Elizabeth Siddal. As such, it is an echo of the mourning of Dante himself for Beatrice. Rossetti himself had died in 1882. In 1900, Traquair made a further remarkable illuminated manuscript, this time of Dante's Vita Nuova in the original Italian. Rossetti's translation of this autobiographical work by Dante had been published in 1861, and it is, of course, the key to his own interaction with Dante as an artist. So much so that, as you can see here on the right, Rossetti's images were used to illustrate the original Italian words in an edition from 1903. Now, one of Rossetti's key influences was the Scottish painter David Scott, whom he considered to be the natural successor of William Blake. And here we see portraits of both Rossetti and Scott side by side in a mural by Phoebe Traquair, which dates most probably from 1898. A great deal of Scott's work has been lost, but drawings such as a head of Dante, and a head of and a Dante and Beatrice composition, both of which we see here, the latter copied by his brother and dating from 1845, give some insight. Now, David Scott was one of several Scottish painters of an older generation to whom the pre-Raphaelites looked. He was born in 1806, 22 years before Rossetti, but Scott's brother, William Bell Scott, was also a close contact of Rossetti, and he painted two interesting but undated Boccaccio works, which are a reminder of the importance of Boccaccio to our perception of Dante. David Scott is buried in Dean Cemetery, Edinburgh, with a Celtic Revival headstone designed by his brother, which contained a sculpted portrait in high relief by the pre-Raphaelite sculptor Alexander Munro. Munro came originally from Inverness, and he had studied in Edinburgh. I show here the very beautiful bust of Dante by Munro in Girton College, Cambridge. The similarity with David Scott's drawing is striking, so much so that I think it would be reasonable to think that Munro had seen it. So by the time Phoebe Traquair was making her book of illustrations, there was a significant body of Dante imagery by Scottish artists. The verbal aspect of that book is also important. It is the work of John Sutherland Black, and it is an impressive. For over and above the chronology and bibliography, there is a wonderful section on Dante's library. In Black's own word, it consists of an alphabetical catalogue of authors whom Dante is known to have used or whom may be presumed to have been more or less familiar to him. What a great idea, and beautifully typeset too. I'm sorry I can't spend more time on it. And these are 4 of the 20 Phoebe Triquare diagrams that I turned to when I started reading Alasdair Gray's translation. As you can see, they are detailed and informative. And here is the very first one. And at the heart of it, you can see Dante fainting because of his reaction to the evident grief of Francesca and Paolo. The story of those lovers was very popular with painters, not least David Scott's close contemporary William Dyce, who was born like Scott in 1806, and like Scott was an influence on the Pre-Raphaelites. Dyce picks up on a crucial aspect of Dante's account, namely that it is about not only the power and vicissitudes of love, but the power of the written word. For Francesca and Paolo are reading an Arthurian text that tells of the love of Lancelot and Guinevere. Later, Dyce would make this transcendent vision of Beatrice. By the time he made this work, he had introduced Ruskin to the art of the Pre-Raphaelites, all of whom were over 20 years younger than Dyce. A few years older than Rossetti was another Scottish painter, Joseph Noel Paton, who was born in 1821. In 1852, he painted a notable Francesca da Rimini work, and I also note that the Scottish interest in translating Dante had been underlined 3 years earlier in 1849 by the publication of James Aitken Carlyle's influential prose translation of the Inferno. That translation is, incidentally, a version that Kieran Carson acknowledges as a source. And one thing I'd say about Kieran Carson is that in addition to his wonderful translation itself, there are fabulous notes. In another Francesca work, published in the Art Journal in 1895, we see Paton again emphasizing the significance of reading, as had Dyce. Now, I'll now make some very brief observations about the 20th century response. In 1907, the French sculptor Auguste Rodin, perhaps the most Dante-driven artist of all time, with the exception of Rossetti, had been appointed an honorary member of the Royal Scottish Academy. At that time, Rodin's great admirer, the sculptor James Pittendry McGillivray, was an influential member of the Academy. Now, McGillivray sculpted Burns and Byron, but surprisingly, I can't find a Dante work. There is, however, a roundel of Petrarch, which I show here, and a lovely bust of Phoebe Triquare. And like Triquare, McGillivray was close to Patrick Geddes's Celtic Revival Circle in Edinburgh. And I now turn to that group for 2 interesting early 20th century Dante contributions. The first is by Robert Traill Rose, who shows Dante and Beatrice in the presence of God in paradise. It's an illustration for Mary McGregor's Stories from Dante, told to the children. And it's interesting to see that Dante had entered children's education at this time, that is to say, around 1909. In his old age, Joseph Noel Paton also supported Patrick Geddes's activities, but I show these 2 drawings by Paton not simply because of their Dante subject matter, but because of the collection they came from, namely that of the Celtic Revival artist John Duncan, another of Geddes's colleagues. Now, Duncan's own interest in Dante can be seen in his Mask of Love, a painting which dates from 1921 and shows a series of figures representing different types of love, beginning with Orpheus and almost concluding with Dante. Here you can see Duncan's image of Francesca and Paolo with Dante in the foreground. Now, moving on a decade to the early 1930s, we find a painter 30 years younger than John Duncan, drawing a very different inspiration from Dante. This is William Johnson, who became, like William Dyce, before him, one of London's most significant art educators. He took a keen interest in William Blake's Dante images, not least for teaching purposes. And at the same time, he was painting some of his most formally experimental abstract works, and one can see and indeed feel the influence of Blake's ideas. I don't know if Johnson influenced the work of Jeff McEwen, but McEwen's exploration of Dante has been notable since his one-person show on the Divine Comedy at the Talbot Rice Gallery in Edinburgh in 1986. He's also made later work, such as this one we see on the left here from 2008. I think this image is part of the Dante exhibition currently at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It is interesting to note that McEwen has also explored Ramon Llull, the Mallorquin contemporary of Dante, who was, like Dante, a pioneer of European literature in the vernacular. So, almost in conclusion, I return to Dante's dream to explore briefly Scottish advocates of Gallery, Liverpool, but it was commissioned from Rossetti, as I have noted, by his friend, the Glasgow businessman, William Graham. Graham was one of Rossetti's key early collectors, as was George Ray from Aberdeen, who was an early owner of Mona Vanna, that is to say, Beatrice's companion, Lady Giovanna, who is referred to in La Vita Nuova. Both William Graham and George Ray were working near Liverpool at the time of their patronage. After Rossetti's death, a third Scot, Frank Tennant, became a collector of his work. The Salutation of Beatrice, painted in 1859, was part of Tennant's collection at Lymm Castle in Kent. And here it all begins to link up. For around 1909, Tennant also commissioned decoration of a piano from Phoebe Traquair, illustrating Rossetti's Willowwood, along with scenes from the Song of Solomon. And that brings me back to the artist who has been the Virgil-like guide to my presentation, Phoebe Anna Traquair. I will conclude simply by noting again her achievement with respect to Dante and remembering her as a wonderful predecessor of the equally wonderful Alasdair Gray. Thanks for listening.
Thanks enormously, Murdo. That was a wonderful journey, a wonderful voyage through all of these images. I have the impression and the understanding that what we're doing in this whole afternoon is to bring all of these things together with the prospect of exploring them even much more thoroughly in further sessions. These are only opening doors. It's wonderful. So I'm not going to dwell on this at the moment, but pass on straight to John Purser, who is a poet, a composer, a playwright, a musicologist, a music historian. His PhD at Glasgow University became the book, The Literary Works of Jack B. Yeats, and he has also written a biography of the great modern composer, Eric Chisholm, of whom we'll hear more in a moment. More recently, along with Meg Bateman, his colleague at Chalmorostig, the Gaelic College in Skye, at the University of the Highlands in the Islands, John has produced a magnum opus entitled Window to the West, Culture and Environment in the Scottish Gaeltacht. And extraordinarily, this is not published yet as a book, but it is in its whole almost 1,000 pages of wonderful complexity and richness, available freely and online. And I think Cassie will be able to post the link to Window to the West for anybody to have access to. Believe me, it's an extremely risky business. If you dip into this work, and you can be lost for hours at a time, but you'll come out enriched, hugely enriched. Perhaps John is most famous, though, for his work on a book and a radio series entitled Scotland's Music, first published in 1992 and broadcast on BBC Radio Scotland in a series, first of all, of 30 programmes of an hour and a half long, and then revised entirely and broadcast in 50 programmes. John's work on Scotland's music, I'm tempted to say that, like Dante and like Alasdair Gray, we're looking at a poet, an epic poet with an epic vision here. So John's going to talk to us about pictures from Dante by two Scottish composers, Eric Chisholm and William Wallace. And just before I hand over to him, I should say that he and his wife, he and his American wife Bar, live on the Isle of Skye and work as crofters. They are crofters, keeping a small herd of cattle. And most recently, John's poetry has been collected in two books. The first collected poems called There Is No Night, which was published in 2014. And more recently, in 2021, just earlier this year, a wonderful book entitled This Much Endures. John, please take it away.
Share screen. Share. Thank you very much, Alan. Are you seeing the PowerPoint here?
Yes.
Good. That should be it on. Okay. Difficult following on such a series of really splendid talks, and not least from Murdo, who is a joint dedicatee of Window to the West. Alan, you are too kind to me, but I'm not going to hang about because we've got music to listen to. This opening image of Alasdair speaks for itself, but behind it lurks the cultivation of fear with respect to the individual human soul, which culminates in the late medieval period in the work of Dante. It has its roots in the Old Testament, but has more than once been claimed as also developed from the visionary literature of the Gallic-speaking Celtic Church. The 6th century Altus Prosator, probably by Columbcille, the 7th century Fiche Adam Naun, and other visionary texts, including Brendan's Navigatio, all concern themselves at various stages with judgment, guilt, punishment, and redemption. And the theme is presented in some of the high crosses, notably that of Murdoch. As a Scot engaging with Dante, Alasdair was therefore in a Celtic tradition which preceded Dante by more than 500 years. A significant aspect of that tradition is that it's not tied to individual personalities of the day or from history. Unlike Dante in the 14th century, the early medieval visions aren't concerned with particular examples, whereas Dante demands our attention to the political and religious intrigues of his own time. How then best to engage with this powerful journey from utter depravity to ultimate salvation? Well, one doesn't have to. In 1884, Mackenzie might well have used his situation in Italy to respond to Dante. He knew that he was composing above the battlefield on which Dante fought. He was a close friend of Liszt's and conducted Liszt's work, though never the Dante symphony. But Mackenzie has no truck with hell, none at all. However, two Scottish composers, successors to Mackenzie, responded to Dante with vivid insight and, be it noted, as much to Dante's vision of paradise as that of Inferno. Both composers knew the work of Liszt, but Liszt's Dante symphony only hints at paradise, Wagner having persuaded him that no mortal could convey its glories, which is presumably a Wagnerian indictment of Dante. The two composers are William Wallace and Eric Chisholm, and for sure, neither of them was a Calvinist. Wallace was a doctor with a deeply humane understanding and a profound religious conviction full of aspiration rather than the need for repentance. Chisholm was an atheist with an unsurpassed poetic vision. Wallace's Creation Symphony is a powerful symbolic evocation of the creation with mankind, and the composer and his fiancée, by the way, a student of McGillivray and Rodin's, both he and his wife are incorporated into the extraordinary number symbolism of the work. But his direct engagement with Dante in his symphonic tone poem, The Passing of Beatrice, from 1892, you can read his note as you listen to the end of the piece. Now it starts quietly, but does get louder. Eric Chisholm's pictures from Dante comes from half a century later than the Wallace and draws inspiration from Doré's famous illustrations, which he refers to in the full score. So these are tied directly to the music. I can't play you his opening of the Inferno as it's so terrifyingly and immediately loud that you'd run to your volume controls. Here, however, is part of the same opening section, which is responding to the text that you see on the screen. Chisholm's Inferno is a theme with variations, in fact, based upon bagpipe themes. The first variation is brief, but extremely violent, and you can hear the dies irae trudging in the bass. Not a place you want to hang around in. The contrast between that first movement and the second movement, he doesn't deal with Purgatorio, could scarcely be more marked. The Paradiso opens with a truly beautiful and very dignified hymn in medieval style. And I've tried to find out if in fact Chisholm had got this from a medieval source, and I can't find it. So I assume that he is the composer of the tune as well. It's certainly absolutely wonderful. Chisholm was a master of harmony and of orchestration, and he was also a master of counterpoint, but that section I will have to omit. So let us hear this description in music of the angels descending from down the steps. This final example is the conclusion of the piece, mostly very quiet. And I'm going to ask you to listen really attentively right to the very end of it. It is in a way quite remarkable that it is out of Scotland with our long Calvinistic tradition and involvement with the concept of hell, that in fact some of the most inspiring music in relation to the concept of paradise and redemption is coming from two Scottish composers. The end of this, the flute is floating up there and ends up with this magical trilling along with the celeste, and then it disappears as though it was a dream. But no, it returns to assure us that redemption is always there for us, always. So here we go, the end of Chisholm's Paradiso. Alasdair didn't know this music. How could he? Most of us, even most classical music lovers in Scotland, have never heard it. But these two Scottish masterworks should have an honoured place in Dante studies and in their assertion of the superiority of redemption over retribution. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks enormously. With Murdo's exposition of the visual images and with your own of the music, there's just so much more to explore. And it also strikes me that both of these papers and everything that we've heard amount to a kind of repudiation of the most famous lines of Eliot, that I did not think that death had undone so many. No, I did not know that life had vitalized so much, and that the life of the arts, the life of the paintings and the life of the music can vitalize in such ways that, as you say, so many people simply have never heard of or seen or heard. I'm very aware of time pressing upon us, and I'm very glad that Joseph Farrell is with us now. He couldn't be here earlier on to talk at the very start in the first session, but he is here now, and I'm going to pass on to him immediately. Joseph Farrell is Emeritus Professor of Italian at the University of Strathclyde, and is one of the most, if not the most, essential contemporaries in Scotland who bring Scotland and Italy together, in person, of course, but also in scholarship and in our understanding of the affinities and historical connections between Scotland and Italy. So he's going to talk to us. His most recent publications, I should say, are Honour and the Sword, The Culture of Duelling, and Robert Louis Stevenson in Samoa. He's also, I believe, the convener of the Robert Bontyne Cunningham Graham Society, another aspect of his work of presenting all of these fantastic cultural exemplifications to a broader readership audience. He's going to talk to us today about Scotland as a part of Europe, a Europe-wide Res Public Christiana, with reference to Michael Scott and to Edward I, and coming back to Alasdair Gray. So I'll just simply hand over to you, Joseph Farrell.
Okay, Alan, you're very kind. Thank you very much. I apologise for having missed the earlier sessions, which seemed quite fascinating, and I hope I shall not be repeating things that I've already said. I can't claim to have been a close friend of Alasdair Gray, nor indeed of Dante Alighieri, come to that. But I did meet Alasdair a couple of times. First, one time in Oran Moor, and he gave me a discourse on the Divine Comedy he was working on. The second time he handed me his more or less completed manuscript and asked me if I would correct any mistakes. He even gifted me a pencil to make that task easier. Obviously, I did no such thing, so I cannot claim credit nor any blame for anything there may be. But what he did say to me then was that at some points, and this obviously is the difference between a translation done by a poet or a creative spirit and one done by a professional or an academic, that he was going to take all kinds of liberties, that if he got bored, he would cut back on what Dante had done. On the other hand, and I'm more or less quoting him, if he found that in some passage Dante had not fully exploited his own creativity, then he would do that for him. Obviously, I don't need to repeat, I'm sure it's been said, that if Alasdair Gray claimed on the cover of the book to have English in prosaic verse, he much more Scottish in verse prosaic, or so as you may wish. Dante himself then obviously was the great international poet, but he's a mixture of internationalism on the one hand, but then, if you like, localism on the other. It may be that all great writers are ultimately local writers, or even provincial writers. In his case, then obviously his dedication was to Florence, rather than to Italy, which did not really exist. Florence, which had made him an exul emeritus, an undeserved exile. But he was following events all over Europe, so we find continual references: France, Spain, Catalonia, Hungary, Germany, and obviously to the various Italian city-states. The references to Scotland are marginal and few, but I want to bring them out, because what I want to emphasise, as Alan just mentioned, is that at that time, Scotland and Scots were part of a wide Res Publica Christiana. Scotland, in its own right, was a part of that. Now, there we come up against difficulties because Dante's most fundamental political belief, set out throughout the Divina Commedia, particularly in the Paradiso, but also in another work, the De Monarchia, was that in Europe there should be a universal church and also a universal empire, and both of them had were to have their seat in Rome, the selected city. That was his ideal. So therefore he had some kind of difficulty with some of the other states. Dante, of course, in this was completely ahistorical in the sense that the nation state was beginning to emerge. They had emerged in many cases, England, Scotland, and also France. All right, as he goes through on his journey, the first person in Scotland that he meets, and the best known, comes in Inferno, comes in Hell, where we come up against Michael Scott of Balwearie, which is in Fife. I'm going to give you my own translations of the 3 lines from Dante, which are reduced to 2 lines by Alasdair Gray. What Dante has is that other who so small about the flanks was Michael Scott, and indeed he really knew the game of magic frauds. This is the circle of alchemists, astronomers, or astrologers. These were overlapping sections of that time, and also of translators. Obviously, translation was not a sin which deserved damnation. Astrology, magic, on the other hand, was. Michael Scott, I think, really deserves more merit than Dante gives him as a philosopher. And as a translation, was one of the intermediaries between the Arab world and the Latin world. Alasdair Gray's translation is much more brief. He says, on his lean shanks, see stalking Michael Scott, the Caledonian astrologer. I don't know, by the way, why Dante insists so much on the lean shanks, or small about the shanks, the flanks, who I've more literally translated there. Michael Scott, I dare say, will be well known to many of you, if not from Dante. There are some questions over his dates. He was born around 1190, died around 1250, to the best of our knowledge. He may very well have died in Scotland. He may very well be buried in Melrose Abbey. Those of you who visited it will know that there is a tomb to Michael Scott. I've tried to get the Historical Environment Scotland, as they are now known, to put up a plaque there, even if they put it up in Italian, for Michael Scott is more likely to be even better known. The difficulty, and I confess it's a real one, is that Michael Scott is not exactly an uncommon name in that part of the world. So was this Michael Scott of Balweary, the astronomer, astrologer, philosopher, alchemist, or was it a local lawyer? Not easy to be known. Michael Scott, in any case, was a very remarkable man. There is a fairly well attested anecdote about him, because having travelled about, having been in Oxford, Paris, and Toledo, where there was a famous school of translators which he attended and where he did some translation, he ended up in the court of the great Emperor Frederick II, stupor mundi, the stupefaction of the world. He was the local philosopher, astrologer, and so on. The anecdote basically says that Frederick, trying to catch Michael Scott out, asked him to measure the distance between the Earth and the nearest of the stars. Michael Scott, who was certainly no fool, set up equipment and took measurements from the steeple of a nearby church and gave Frederick II, the Emperor, an answer, which was obviously irrefutable. Frederick was not convinced, so he had to steeple the church lowered and asked Michael Scott to repeat the experiment, which he did, and came back and told the Emperor that either the church had been lowered or the heavens themselves had received it. He got off scot-free. He turns up in other literature. Boccaccio has a story which involves him. And of course, more famously, Walter Scott introduces him into the lay of the last minstrel. However, I wish to quote from another poet, much more recent, Douglas Dunn, who wrote in tones of mock outrage over the treatment afforded to this man from Balweary in Fife, or possibly from Tayport. And Douglas Dunn writes these lines: "The wizard Michael Scott was born near here. I might have guessed you more like that and worse, alchemist, polymath, astrologer to the Holy Roman Empire. Tayport's son mastered all knowledge, too controversial for Dante, who invented his damnation in the Inferno. Quote, Tayport, man in hell, they'd say in the Fife Herald. sorcerer from Capote, slandered by Tuscan. Well, slandered he may have been. He was put into hell, which I think was rather harsh treatment. He made a real contribution to European culture, but Dante's word on this is final. We'll move on into the Purgatorio, specifically into Canto 7, which is the canto which contains those rulers who were not outright wicked, but who were not quite up to the job, or who were inattentive to matters of state. By the way, the position of Prime Minister had not been invented when Dante was writing this poem, otherwise it may very well have been extended to include some contemporaries of who knows. It's interesting, I think the most remarkable feature of Alasdair Gray's translation or version is its narrative power, which is very strong. That means that he does actually make the changes I was referring to. So, for example, in Dante's original in this canto, there were 136 lines. Alasdair Gray reduces them to 88, but he does expand the brief reference to Scotland. So Virgil explains to Dante that here there are some monarchs who had been, in addition to those who were not up to the job, who had been unfortunate in their offspring. But that was not the case with Henry II of England, who was the father of Edward I, well known to Scottish history. All that Dante says is, sitting alone, Henry of England, who had a better outcome with his branches. Branches is a reference back to a figure of speech Dante had used about another king who had, whose great qualities had not risen through the rami, the branches. This had not been the case with Henry of England. Alasdair Gray, on the other hand, translates this differently. He says, see England's Henry sit apart, alone. A simple king whose Edward, Prince of Wales, is now a hammer of the French and Scots. Dante makes no reference to the nickname, if you like, of Edward as the hammer of the Scots. Alasdair Gray, on the other hand, decides to expand this point and to make it clear exactly what the man who's admired by Dante, who he actually was. I'm going to move on into the Paradiso. We do have some reference to there. I'm going on to Canto 10, which is the heaven of the sun. This is the place of heavenly reward for the learned, for theologians, for mystics, for philosophers. The distinction between theology and philosophy was not particularly strong in the Middle East. Alasdair Gray was obviously a bit impatient for this, so there were 148 lines in the original, which he reduces to 85. Once again, I'll give you a fairly literal translation of Dante. See a flame, the ardent spirit of, and he gives three names, Isidore, Bede, Venerable Bede, and Richard, who in thought was more than man. That last line refers only to Richard. Alasdair Gray, perfectly actually, translates this as, see flaming after him, him being the philosopher Boethius, 4 lights of God, encyclopedic Isidore, and Bede, the venerable English monk, Richard, the mystic Scot. Now it is true that Richard was Scottish, or at least born in Scotland. The years of his life, he was in the 12th century from around 1123 to around 1173. He's born in Scotland, but he died in France. He became the prior of an abbey of Saint-Victor, which was on the outskirts of Paris. This reference Dante makes, which Alasdair Gray reduces to the mystic Scot, is perfectly accurate. because this man in the Middle Ages was known as one of the great mystic theologians, more than man, as Dante puts it. Alasdair Gray says, the mystic Scot. One of his works is De Trinitate, for example. What's actually interesting about this man, and I don't claim to be an expert on him, but I have done some reading about him, is that although he wrote about the Trinity, although he wrote about works of mysticism, nevertheless, the historians of that time are in agreement that this fundamental starting point for him was sensory experience. In other words, without exaggerating, he was something of an empiricist. So if you really, really wanted to underline things, you could see a certain continuity between him and on to Duns Scotus, but even on to the empiricism, which was later the dominant field in British and Scottish philosophy. I would not like to put together in the one hand Prior Richard, the mystic theologian, and David Hume, who was a more precise empiricist, but you can consider these matters if you wish. We're going to continue through Paradiso, this time coming to Canto 19, the Heaven of Jupiter, where there is a narrator, a speaker, who is the ego, the divine ego, who reaffirms divine justice, who is the spokesperson for divine justice, but who later on in the same canto delivers bitter invective against wicked rulers, immoral rulers. And this does include not only the kings of France, Spain, Hungary, one of the others, but also the kings both of Scotland and of England. Remember, Dante was alive during the period of the Scottish Wars of Independence, the time of Wallace and Bruce, and he was aware of what was going on there. Once again, Alasdair Gray reduces this canto in length from 148 to 81. He seems to be a bit exasperated with some of it. In any case, the eagle, when he's speaking, once again, my humble translation, there you will see the pride which brings thirst, which makes the Scotsman and the Englishman so mad that they cannot remain within due boundaries. Alasdair Gray, on the other hand, reduces this a bit. The context is that on Judgment Day, and Gray's lines are, there shall be an arrogance maddening, there shall be seen arrogance maddening English and Scots who battle constantly across the border, nature built for them. You have to bear in mind Dante's own politics. As I said, he believed in a universal empire with its headquarters in Rome and a universal church. For Dante, from a political point of view, not from a moral point of view. From a moral point of view, the most serious of all sins was treachery. From a political point of view, the most serious of all sins was avarice, which is why he wanted, one of the reasons why he wanted a universal emperor, who being the empire of all that he surveyed would be of necessity free of avarice. So Dante believed. Dante saw the sin of avarice, but he saw it equally in Scotland and in England. He said, why don't they just stay in their own place? Nature has built for them, in Alasdair Gray's translation, a border. Why don't they respect that? But this is the failure to respect that makes them mad, and that is exactly Dante's word. I do find this a bit, in some ways, strange. Dante was a very patriotic Florentine. When he came to Scotland, was he a nationalist? Was he a unionist? Well, he could have been either, or he could really have been neither. Basically, he thought there were frontiers, and there was this avarice which led people, led by kings, to go across that. He was disappointed. So, also And that, I'm afraid, was the last one on Scotland inside his ideal, or his belief of Christianity. But he was aware of what was happening.
Thanks enormously, Joe. You've taken us through the whole of the Divine Comedy marvelously, smartly, and going from peak to peak in certain respects. Again, it's as if we've opened doors to questions that we'll want to carry on pursuing for ages. I'll hand you back to Saoirse now before we come to the final readings. And Saoirse's going to resume her position as chairing the afternoon. Saoirse, thanks.
Thank you. What an inspiring afternoon it's been. And as you said, Alan, we're only really skimming the surface, aren't we? I'm aware we're mindful of time. So there are a couple of questions, and obviously anything else we can follow up after the event. Carla or Alan, I wondered if you might want to answer this question. I know you'd mentioned in your paper earlier, Carla, the reference to the Divine Comedy within Lanark, and obviously Alasdair was aware of the Divine Comedy when he was writing Lanark's. Why do you think it took him until the end of his career to create his own interpretation of it?
The question for me, well, it's a $1 million question. It's difficult to answer that, especially when you are in Italy and you have no access to archives. So that would be the question I will answer as soon as I can travel back to Scotland and do some research up there. But who knows? Yeah, this was something I was going to address in my paper. There are a couple of reasons, very quickly, possible reasons. One is the way in which Scottish literature was constructed, has been constructed until recently. And that's me perhaps being a little bit argumentative. It's being like explaining Scottish literature with other Scottish literature. So perhaps there has been a reluctance on the part of many scholars to investigate other influences. And perhaps, I don't know, Dante's studies, Dante scholars are perhaps less drawn to contemporary renderings and creative re-elaboration, because Lanark obviously is not a translation, could be at best described as a parodic rewriting. So perhaps it did not attract that attention even, on that side. But, beyond this, it would be difficult to give explanation. It would be interesting to see if there are any notes, letters that Alasdair Gray left about this or other considerations he made about the Commedia. That's more or less what I can say about it.
Thank you.
There are fascinating prospects if you think of what might have influenced Alasdair earlier on. If things go in early and they go in deep, then they stay with you for such a long time. I was thinking about the illustrations of Gustave Doré and how they affected Chisholm in the musical composition. So that sense of what he's responding to is visualization in his imagination, as well as the narrative. And the narrative, as Joe I think said, takes you right through it. But there's also a curious question that Edwin Morgan, in his latter years, returns to, first of all, the life of Christ, and then to Gilgamesh, one of the earliest texts. It's almost as if these contemporary major Scottish writers are returning to something essential in the whole history of the West, or the whole history of literature, and beyond the West, actually, beyond the West, a kind of global understanding. And that Alasdair is part of that. It bears further inquiry.
Yeah, absolutely. Like everything has this afternoon, really, hasn't it? And maybe I wondered if I could pose this question to Susan. And I wondered if you could, maybe talk a bit more about maybe Alasdair's criteria and his selection of what areas within the Divine Comedy he chose to interpret or translate, and other parts that he maybe skimmed over or ignored.
Gosh, that's an enormous question. I think what I found really interesting about this, and I have to say, I'm not an Alasdair Gray specialist. So when I was first invited to this, the first thing I did was get hold of a copy, order myself a copy, and then read the whole thing. And I found it a super experience. I think because I teach the Dante for my MA and Phil students. And I've been using various translations, but this one I found really fascinating. And the first impression obviously is he shortens things. He shortens, he cuts. What's the function of those cuts? And what I was trying to illustrate in my short presentation, when I used the example of the Beatrice episode, time and again, he cuts, but then he adds explanatory passages. And he does it in a really clever, subtle way. And I've been thinking I'm going to do a lot more on this, of looking at quite how it's almost like with that Beatrix episode, he tells you the story of Dante's first encounter with Beatrice. And he, again and again, he's telling you things, he's giving you information. I made tons of notes on this. And therefore, rather than, I found it a relief not to have to endlessly read explanatory notes. And I thought he's making a reader, to me, he's made a reader-friendly comedy.
Yeah,
and a reader-friendly for the 21st century.
Yeah, fantastic comment on that. Thank you, Susan. I wondered if Dara might be interested in this question. There's a great deal of music in Dante, especially in the Paradiso, and do panel members maybe think that Gray captured that aspect sufficiently in his rendition? I know you'd referred to the Dante sort of drum kit and the musicality in your paper, and just wondered if you wanted to come in on that one, Dara.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there definitely is. I mean, I mean, we've all mentioned the way he kind of compresses the counters and makes them shorter. But there is a great deal of musicality, and there is funny, when I saw that question in the question and answers, it made me think. There's this wonderful episode in Canto 2, the Purgatorio, when Dante meets the soul who's just recently arrived on the shores of Purgatory, of his old friend Casella, who was a musician and a singer of poetry. Because remember that there is the kind of performative aspect of all of this poetry. These are called cantos. You're supposed to say them out loud. I mean, Dante was writing in a culture where not many people would be able to read. He wrote in this Florentine language so that men and women who were uneducated could also have access to this poetry, to hear it sung or recited. And as you heard, I mean, this has been going on for generations as well. But there is this wonderful moment, and I think Alasdair Gray really captures it, because there's this encounter, and I just want to read it to you, because it is in itself very musical, but by the same token, he does get the purpose of the passage. This is all shut down by a very severe Cato, says you're not supposed to be hanging around on this beach anymore. But what is interesting about it is that he begs Casella to sing him a song, and the song that Casella chooses is one of Dante's own songs from his previous poetry of his youth. And I just read it for you here because I think it's wonderful. Please, if death has not deprived you of your art, sing verses I once wrote to cheer my heart. He sang, love that converses with my mind, so sweetly that it sounds within me still. My masters and the others listen too, as if it wholly occupied their will, till, like a thunderclap, Cato appeared, shouting, "You lazy louts, why linger here?" And he kind of puts a stop to it. But there is a great sense, there's a great ear to it. And what people are talking about earlier on in the question and answers about what brought him to Dante, and I've often thought about this, because I'm always amazed and intrigued why poets in particular are brought to translating Dante in later years, and the kinds of poets that do it. And I always think of the Irish example of Seamus Heaney, who's perhaps, on a par here with he never did the entirety of the Commedia, but he said something very interesting. And this is, I suppose, from the Irish perspective, but there would be a kind of a version of this, I suppose, for the Scottish version. I'm just going to read what he wrote. He said, and in this, Heaney is following Joyce. He says, it is the Joycean example, a way into free space to dodge instead of allowing the English tradition, imperial politically, imposing culturally, to marginalize the Irish poet. The strategy that Joyce viewed was to marginalize the Anglo-Saxon Protestant tradition by going to the Mediterranean. But for me, that was not a tactic. This is Heaney now talking about why he approached Dante. It had to do with the psychic imprint of the Catholic faith. In Ireland, we grew up as rural Catholics with little shrines at the crossroads. But deep down, we realized that the whole official culture had no place for them. Then I read Dante, and I found in a great work of literature that the little shrine in the corner had a cosmic amplification. And everybody has kind of talked about it in one way or another. This local, the local in Dante, this is what is appealing to poets, musically and poetically.
Yeah, and you can see then, obviously, the appeal with Gray, with Glasgow. Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that wonderful answering of two questions there, Dara. Thank you. And a nice way to maybe hand over to Carla, who I think is going to introduce now the reading section of the symposium.
Yes, that is going to be the grand finale of a truly splendid conference with so many inspiring papers and ideas. I'm going to introduce Lucilla, as I've already introduced Alan. Lucilla Giagnoni is an Italian actress, scriptwriter, author, and she's one of the most original interpreters of La Divina Commedia. A selection of her readings were broadcast by Rai, and they're still available on the Rai on-demand channel. She has collaborated with many leading Italian writers and directors, including Vittorio Gassman, Alessandro Baricco, Giuseppe Bertolucci, Sebastiano Vassalli, and she's the director of the Teatro Faraggiana in Novara. Now, the first excerpt is from Canto 5 from the Inferno, lines 73 and 142, and that will be the section focusing on the heartbreaking story of the lovers, Paolo and Francesca, condemned to the darkness of hell with the souls of the lustful. We will start with the recording by Lucilla Giagnoni, followed by the reading of Gray's translation by Alan.
Poscia ch'io ebbi il mio dottore udito nomar le donne antiche cavalieri, pietà mi giunse e fui quasi smarrito. I cominciai: poeta, volontieri parlerei a quei due che insieme vanno e paionsi al vento esser leggeri. Ed elli a me: vedrai quando saranno più presso a noi, e tu allor li priega per quello amor che imela, ed ei verranno. Sittosto come il vento a noi li piega, mossi la voce: oh anime affannate, venite a noi parlar, s'altri nol niega. Quali colombe dal disio chiamate, con l'ali alzate e ferme al dolce nido, vegnon per l'aere dal voler portate, cotali uscir dalla schiera ov'è dido, a noi venendo per l'aere maligno, sì forte fu l'affettuoso grido. Animal grazioso e benigno, che visitando vai per l'aere verso noi, che tignemmo il mondo di sanguigno. Se fosse amico il re dell'universo, noi pregheremmo lui della tua pace, poiché hai pietà del nostro mal perverso. Di quel che udire che parlar vi piace, noi udiremo e parleremo a voi, mentre che il vento come fa si tace. Siede la terra dove è nata fui, sulla marina dove il po discende, per aver pace coi seguaci sui. Amor ch'al cor gentil ratto s'apprende, prese costui della bella persona che mi fu tolta, e il modo ancor m'offende. Amor ch'a nullo amato amar perdona, mi prese del costui piacer sì forte, che come vedi ancor non m'abbandona. Amor condusse noi ad una morte, Cain attende chi a vita ci spense. Queste parole d'allor ci fuor porte. Quando io intesi quell'animo offense, chinai il viso e tanto il tenni basso, finché il poeta mi disse: che pense? Quando risposi cominciai: oh lasso, quanti dolci pensier, quanto disio menò costoro al doloroso passo. Poi mi rivolsi a loro e parlai io e cominciai: Francesca, i tuoi martiri a lagrimar mi fanno tristo e pio. Ma dimmi, al tempo di dolci sospiri, a che e come concedette, amore, che conosceste i dubbiosi disiri? E quella a me. Nessun maggior dolore che ricordarsi del tempo felice nella miseria. E ciò sa il tuo dottore. Ma sa conoscer la prima radice del nostro amor. Tu hai cotanto affetto. Dirò come colui che piange e dice: noi leggiavamo un giorno per diletto, di lanciallotto come amor lo strinse, soli eravamo e senza alcun sospetto. Per più fiate gli occhi ci sospinse quella lettura e scolorocci il viso, ma solo un punto fu quel che ci vinse. Quando leggemmo il disiato riso esser baciato da cotanto amante, questi che mai da me non fia diviso. La bocca mi baciò tutto tremante. Galeotto fu il libro e chi lo scrisse. Quel giorno più non vi leggemmo avante. Mentre che l'uno spirito questo disse, l'altro piangea. Sì che di pietade io venni men, così com'io morisse, e caddi come corpo morto cade.
Poet, I said, let me talk with that pair who seem more gently carried by the air. Said he, if they come near enough to hear, invite them by the love they clearly share. The wind now tossed them close. Oh, harried souls, I cried, if none forbid, please talk to me. Like homing doves, they glided to my side. One said, dear good and kindly living soul, who frees us briefly from our storm-tossed state, if we could pray, we'd pray that you find rest, that blessed rest that cannot be our fate. The only way to show our gratitude for these few moments out of whirling hell is telling you all that you wish to know. My birthplace was a town where River Po enters the sea. I married, lovelessly, a hard old man. His brother at my side, whom I love still, had youth and gentleness. As he enjoyed my body, we were found and slain. Our killer's place in hell will be among the murderers who followed Cain. Sighing, I bowed my head. My guide inquired, what thought distresses you? Sorrow for youth, and what befalls youth's sweetness, I replied. Francesca, please believe I pity you. But tell me what occurred that led you to the deed you knew was sin. Worst grief, said she, is happiness recalled in misery. Your master knows this well, and if you need to understand, I'll tell as you command. To pass an idle hour one afternoon, we chanced to read of how Sir Lancelot was overcome by love of Guinevere. This youth, who never shall depart from me, trembling all over, dared to kiss my mouth. That book seduced us. There's no more to say, except, of course, we read no more that day. She wept. The other spirit wept. Me, too. The three of us shed tears without restraint because I could not give them any help. I clutched my head, fell down in a faint.
Thank you. That was a splendid reading, both of you. The next passage is from Canto 26, again from Inferno, lines 85, 142. And this is the story of the bold voyage beyond the pillars of Hercules, of Ulysses, and of the shipwreck which killed him and his men when they had come in sight of the mountain of Purgatory. Again, we will listen first to Lucilla's version, and then Alan will read Gray's translation.
L'omaggio corno della fiamma antica cominciò a crollarsi mormorando, pur come quella cui vento affatica, indi la cima qua e là menando, come fosse la lingua che parlasse. Gittò voce di fuori e disse: quando mi dipartì da Circe che sottrasse me più di un anno là presso a Gaeta, prima che sì Enea la nomasse, né dolcezza di figlio, né la pietà del vecchio padre, né il debito amore, lo qual dovea Penelope far lieta, vincer potero dentro a me l'ardore, chi ebbe a divenir del mondo esperto, e dei vizi umani, e del valore. Ma misi me per l'alto mare aperto, sol con un legno, con quella compagna picciola, dalla qual non fui diserto. L'un lito e l'altro vidi infin la Spagna, fin nel Morrocco e l'isola di Sardi, e l'altre che quel mare intorno bagna. Io e i compagni eravam vecchi e tardi, quando venimmo a quella foce stretta, dove Ercule segnò i suoi riguardi. Acciò che l'uom più oltre non si metta. Dalla man destra mi lasciai Sibiglia, dall'altra già m'avea lasciata Setta. O frati, dissi, che per 100 miglia perigli siete giunti all'Occidente a questa tanto picciola vigilia di nostri sensi, che è del rimanente. Non vogliate negar l'esperienza di retro al sol del mondo senza gente. Considerate la vostra semenza. Fatti non foste a viver come bruti, ma perseguir virtute e conoscenza. I miei compagni piaciosi acuti, con questa orazione picciola al cammino, che appena poscia li avrei ritenuti, e volta nostra poppa nel mattino, dei remi facemmo ali al folle volo, sempre acquistando dal lato mancino. Tutte le stelle già dell'altro polo vedea la notte, e il nostro tanto basso che non surgia fuor del marinsuolo. 5 volte era acceso e tante casso lo lume era di sotto dalla luna, poiché entrati eravam nell'alto passo. Quando n'apparve una montagna bruna per la distanza, e parvemi alta tanto quanto veduta non avea alcuna. Noi ci allegrammo, e tosto tornò in pianto, che della nuova terra un turbo nacque, e percosse del legno il primo canto. 3 volte il fe girar con tutte l'acque, alla quarta levar la poppa in suso, e la prora ire in giù, come altrui piacque infinché il mare fu sovra noi, richiuso.
When the flame came to where my guide thought best, I heard him cry, "Please pause, hear our request. We are two poets who would be your friends and wish to know what we have never read in Homer's epic, how you met your ends." One flaming horn, the biggest of the pair, first roared and wavered as if struck by wind. Then the point flickered, speaking like a tongue. Bound back from Troy, I lost my way. My men, my ships, through storms, monsters, and women's wilds, till winning home at last, I found myself unfit for quiet life with wife and son. Choosing a crew of some I knew from Troy, we put to sea, sailed west, and reached that strait twixt Africa and Spain, leading into the boundless ocean, circling the globe. Hercules put a pillar on each shore, inscribed, "Do not sail through." And so, none had. "Shipmates," said I, "did we dare, share, survive 1,000 dangers in a quest for rest? No. Greeks seek knowledge, virtue, strife, for these is the best of life. Let us sail ahead, discover a new world, and if we fail, what grander way to end can old men find?" They cheered and plied their oars, would not have ceased to drive us onwards had I changed my mind. We sailed for 5 moons south. Equator crossed, strange constellations shone above at night. Then to the east, one day as dawn light spread, we saw by distance dimmed a splendid sight. A land wider than Italy, rising higher than any mountain into sky. Our joy soon changed to grief. From that land came a storm that struck and whirled us 3 times round, heaved our stern high, plunged the prow under waves that closed above us. As God willed, we drowned.
Thank you again. A good reminder that Dante is not made for silent reading. You should read it aloud in the original Italian or in translation. The last passage is the last 16 lines from Canto 33, Paradiso. And this is the final vision at the end of Paradise, when with Mary's intercession, the story is brought full circle. It was because of Mary's pity that Beatrice initially summoned Virgil to lead Dante through hell, purgatory, and heaven. And Mary's intercession allows Dante at last to look upon the light of God directly and experience that transcends intellect, language, and memory. And this was the female or feminine element that Lucilla highlighted in her short introduction. There is then a female voice or a feminine voice, as she says in La Divina Commedia. We are going to invert the order for this final reading. We will start with Alan, and reading Gray's translation, and we will close our conference with Lucilla's reading of Dante.
The good, which is the object of all will, was there, but exists outside is defective. All that exists within is perfectly made. Now know that my words will tell even less of what I recall than if my infant tongue still sucked a breast. The living light remained the same, but I began to change. My strengthened sight saw more. In the profoundest clear ground of the light appeared 3 circles, different colors and same size. 2 reflected each other as rainbows do. The 3rd took fire from them. Alas, such blethering cannot convey the things I noticed in eternal light, fulfilling, knowing, loving its sweet self in that reflecting, circling Trinity. As my eyes dwelled on it, I seemed to see a human form, like the geometer battering his brain in vain to find how circles are squared. I tried to see or feel how such a human form could live in light eternally. The wings of my fancy could not fly so far, until in a flash I saw desire and will. Both are a pair of finely balanced wheels kept turning by love that revolves sun, sky, and every star.
Qual è il geometra che tutto s'affigge per misurar lo cerchio e non ritrova, pensando quel principio dell'indige, tal era io a quella vista nova. Veder voleva, come si convenne, l'imago al cerchio e come vi si indova. Ma non eran da ciò le proprie penne, se non che la mia mente fu percossa da un folgore in che sua voglia venne, all'alta fantasia cui manco possa, ma già volgeva il mio disio e il velle, siccome rota che igualmente è mossa. L'amor che muove il sole e l'altre stelle.
Wow, what a way to thank and what a way to finish, sorry, an inspiring afternoon. I just want to thank everyone who's participated in today's sessions. It's been such a pleasure to sit here and listen to you all and to watch and to learn more about Dante and Alasdair Gray too. Thank you so much for your generosity in sharing and participating in the event today. And as Alan said, opening doors really to other ideas and connections. Cassie will be sending out a follow-up email to this event, and featured on that are some of the links that we mentioned today and some of the information, as well as a couple of future Gray events. Gray Day, the second one, will be happening in February the 25th, 2022. Also, the second International Alasdair Gray Conference, which will be happening, is called Making Imagined Objects, and it's happening on the 16th and 17th of June, hopefully in real life in Glasgow, between Strathclyde University and Glasgow University. Keynote speakers for day one is Ali Smith, a novelist, and for day two, Glasgow School of Arts, Head of Exhibitions, Jenny Brownrigg. So the registration is open for that now, so you can, it's live, so you can go and sign up, and hopefully we will meet in real life in Glasgow to discuss all things Gray related. But a final thank you really to Simona Manca again for her wonderful organisation, for all of you attending. I hope you have a safe onward journey into Christmas, into 2022 and beyond. And many thanks, season's greetings to you all, and goodbye.